Hello and welcome to the Global Perspective Show. I'm John Bersia, Special Assistant to the President for Global Perspectives at UCF. Our guest today is Amy Chua. Amy Chua is a professor of law at Yale University and the author of two books. One, World on Fire, became a bestseller some years ago, and her new book, Day of Empire, we suspect will take the same direction. Welcome, Amy Chua.
Thank you so much, John. It's great to be here.
Great to have you. Why don't you tell us just a little bit about Day of Empire and what inspired you to write it?
Well, the book is, first of all, about hyperpowers, the small category of hyperpowers, which not just empires, not just great powers, not just superpowers, but this small category of societies that amassed such extraordinary economic and military might that they basically dominated the world. So for example, the United States was not a hyperpower during the Cold War because back then it had a rival, the Soviet Union, of roughly comparable might. And one of the things I found was there have been extremely few of these hyperpowers in all of history. So the book really is an exploration of these hyperpowers, asking who were they, who were the United States predecessors, and what, if anything, can they teach us about our own times? And the thesis, actually, is that for all their enormous differences, from Cyrus the Great's Achaemenid Persian Empire, founded in 550 BC, to the great Mongol Empire, to the British Empire, every single hyperpower in history followed a certain pattern. That is, they were each remarkably tolerant and pluralistic during its rise to dominance. And in fact, tolerance was indispensable for the achievement of hegemony. Conversely, the decline of hyperpowers has repeatedly coincided with intolerance and xenophobia.
Now, when you say they were tolerant, I think we need to underscore how much the context is important here.
Absolutely. When you think, were the Mongols really tolerant? I am not talking about tolerance in the sort of modern human rights sense. So by tolerance, I don't mean equality or respect. By tolerance, I just mean letting lots of different kinds of people, even if you don't like or respect them, participate and rise and prosper in your society, regardless of ethnicity, religion, or skin color, and even if it's only for instrumental reasons. So for example, in ancient times, it was only through this kind of strategic tolerance that you could build a really huge army. If you limit your army to, say, only pure-blooded Spartans, it's only going to be so big. It can be incredibly talented, but it's only going to be so big. By contrast, if you open up your military to warriors of every ethnicity and nationality, you can build a really world-class army. And that's exactly what ancient Persia did, and it's, of course, what the Romans did.
Of the historical examples that you studied, was ancient Persia one of your favorites, or was there another one that you were more drawn to?
Well, ancient Persia was the first hyperpower in history, and I was intrigued by it because I had not previously known much about it. I think for most Americans, we think of antiquity, Rome and Greece. But in fact, Achaemenid Persia covered 2 million square miles. It swallowed up and incorporated the great kingdoms of Assyria, Babylonia, Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Greek city-states. And it basically ruled a third of the world's population. But that was sort of a simple story, so it wasn't my favorite. Tolerance there was, you use tolerance to build the largest army, and then you also are tolerant in the sense that you let everybody worship their own gods, you don't interfere, and that's how you make people cooperative and compliant. Rome, of course, went much farther because Rome actually was colorblind. I mean, there was no ethnic ceiling on how far people could rise in Rome. So I also did not know this, that educated men of any race or nationality could rise to the very highest positions of authority, including that of emperor itself. Septimius Severus was a North African. Emperor Septimius Severus was a North African married to a Syrian. So that's sort of a remarkable degree of tolerance in that sense. My favorite case is the Great Mongol Empire.
And what about that appeals to you?
The Great Mongol Empire was founded by Genghis Khan in the 13th century, and it's absolutely fascinating. The Mongols came at one point to rule half the known world. I mean, right up to the gates of Vienna, all of China they conquered, Middle East, Persia, greatest cities, Damascus, Kiev, Moscow, Baghdad. And yet, if you think about it, the Mongols were nomads. Even their leaders, the Khans, were illiterate. They had no engineering, they had very little technology of their own, they had no architecture, no agriculture. They did not even have the technology to bake bread. So how did they conquer so much territory? And part of the answer, actually, is that they were masters at pulling in the people, those with skills and technology from their conquered populations. Most importantly, the Mongols pulled in huge numbers of Chinese engineers. They treated them very well. They pulled them in, and these were engineers who knew how to build the most advanced siege engines of the day. These massive catapults and flame-throwing trebuchets and explosives and retractable ladders. And the Chinese engineers would travel with the Mongol army. And when you would get to a new location, they would just build these siege engines right on the spot. And it was only in this way, by basically harnessing the best and the brightest from among conquered populations, that the Mongols were able to overcome the great walled cities of Eastern Europe, Persia, Central Asia.
And then to bring us into the contemporary period, your book covers all of those historical cases and then looks at the United States, the current hyperpower, and considers some emerging potential hyperpowers. Why, in your opinion, did the United States become a hyperpower, and do you anticipate that it will stay there for the next 50 years, 75 years? We seem to be rather time limited because of the other emerging ascendant nations.
Right. Well, first of all, one of the interesting things about this project is that the role of tolerance changes. Tolerance is always the secret, but for ancient powers, it was tolerance was the way that you built the biggest army. You got the most number of soldiers. Fast forwarding to modern times, being a hyperpower is no longer about having the most foot soldiers. It's about having the most advanced technology, the most economic productivity, the most lethal weaponry. But interestingly, for that, tolerance is still key. And the reason for that is because at any given point in time, the best human capital the world has to offer, whether in terms of intelligence, skill, creativity, drive, is never going to be found within any one ethnic group or one religious group. So to be globally dominant, not just regionally dominant, but globally dominant, a society has to pull in the best and brightest from all over the world, really. That's the only way you can stay at the very cutting edge of the technology and therefore economic and military frontier. So tolerance changed. It used to be about treating conquered peoples well and co-opting them, taking them in your armies. In modern times, tolerance plays a different role. The way to become a hyperpower these days is basically by turning yourself into an immigration magnet. And the Dutch Republic actually did this first in the 17th century for a very brief period, pulled in the most talented people from Jews who were being persecuted in Portugal and Spain, Protestants who were being persecuted. And the United States, in many ways, followed the same pattern. That is, I think that the secret to the United States' continued rise for the last several centuries, couple centuries, is actually rooted in its ability to pull in the best and brightest from everywhere. We have many stains on our history, but I don't think that the secret has been militarism. I think the reason we have our military dominance is because of our technological dominance, and the reason for that is because we were able to pull in the best minds and scientists really from every corner of the world. So going forward, in some ways, it's an optimistic story because take China. That's a power that everybody talks about, the rising tiger. Well, I think China's doing lots of things right. I think we'll continue to explode economically. It's pouring money into R&D, into education. But if my idea is right, that to be globally dominant, you have to be able to pull in the world's best human capital, then I don't think China can become a hyperpower. I mean, it can become very, very strong, but China is the quintessentially ethnically defined nation. It's the opposite of an immigrant nation. So even today, you see lots of talented Chinese engineers still wanting to come to America to become US citizens, but you really don't see large numbers of American engineers and scientists or European scientists wanting to move to China to become Chinese citizens. I mean, they may go there as part of their corporations, but they're not Chinese citizens. So I think, in a way, it's ours for the losing, and I do think that we've made a lot of mistakes in the last 5 years, but I think that in many ways we have the right formula. Lots of things can go wrong. I think if we take a paranoid, sort of fear-based, xenophobic reaction, we will shoot ourselves in the foot. I think it's also possible that if we did nothing wrong, that China and other powers might just rise so that basically the U.S. falls from its hyperpower status. So you just go back to a world where you have several great powers, all of roughly comparable strength. Some people think that would be a better thing. I mean, being a hyperpower brings a lot of costs, too. And one of the points of my book is that actually, as a democratic hyperpower, we can't realize many of the benefits that our predecessors enjoyed.
To go back to China's intentions here, there are many who think that China is bent on dominating Asia, dominating the world. I was reading an article in Foreign Affairs recently by Victor Cha, which you may have seen, called "Is China Winning Asia?" And it was basically a defense of the current administration's Asia and global policies, and said that in fact the United States is better positioned than ever in Asia. But the question that kept coming back to me was the question that you asked in your book, which is it really in China's interest to become a hyperpower? Or are there so many potential negatives associated with that that it might be better to stop at a lesser place on the hierarchy?
I think, now of course I'm not on the inside, but based on everything I know, including people who are in China, I really don't think that that's China's goal right now, to be world dominant hyperpower. I think it's completely likely that they would like to be the regional power, but right now I think their main concentration is just trying to continue to explode economically. They're securing national resources in Latin America and Africa, and they're doing this kind of soft power thing very well, building relations, promoting investment ties, and actually just sort of fostering a public image internationally that is much more successful than what the United States has done. But I don't think it's in China's interest right now, for example, to try to become a military policeman or anything like that. I think that's the last thing it wants to do. So, I mean, China's not one thing, too. There are different factions in there. But I think, at least for the moment, China is very happy not being number one and being the one, sort of in the center of global resentment and the target for the world's disaffected. In fact, it's ironic. I mean, China can happily invest in Sudan, genocide-supporting regimes. It can not follow human rights. It can crush free speech. And its sort of image internationally right now, polls show much more favorable than that of the United States.
Exactly. And it seems to me, from looking at China's foreign policy priorities, where there's an emphasis on defense, an emphasis on economic development, an emphasis on territorial integrity. These are all things that are China-specific. It's more inward-looking to an extent for a foreign policy than it is outward-looking.
It's always been that way. China, precisely because it is so big already, it's got a fifth of the world's population. As my mother said, the main problem is there are too many people. The idea that they would want to conquer more lands or be imperial, for this reason, for all of China's 3,000-year history, the wall has been such a symbol. Let's keep out the barbarians, the people from the steppe. Now, interestingly, one of my favorite chapters in the book is about Tang Dynasty China in the 7th century, which really was the one exception. That was the one dynasty in China that, like today, was very cosmopolitan, very open, and actually openly embracing the barbarians beyond the steppe. I mean, saying, in very modern terms, they're sort of equals. And interestingly, that was the one dynasty that was sort of imperialistic. It went all the way, really exerted power over Central Asia, parts of Persia, Vietnam, Korea. Whether China's interested in doing that today is a different question. I mean, it doesn't seem to me right now that that's a first priority at all. But I still think that their interest right now is principally economic. I do think they will, anytime the U.S. dares China to do something, China flexes its muscles and says, we don't take orders from anybody. but I don't think that that's their main priority, to be sort of a military hegemon in any way.
And what about the United States for the near term? I don't think most people anticipated the collapse of the Soviet Union, which allowed the United States to become the hyperpower, the hegemon, and that development seems to be very much looked upon with concern by most of the world and feared.
Yeah, well, one of the most interesting things, lots of people compare the U.S. to Rome these days, and it's a very good comparison for lots of good reasons. But Rome had a huge advantage. Rome could make the people it conquered and dominated part of the Roman Empire. It basically could brilliantly extended citizenship to Gauls and Britons and Africans and Spaniards. So all these people that it dominated felt Roman, and they felt proud to be part of the Roman Empire. And America, as a democracy, can do no such thing. So there's a real limit on the advantages that we can secure. It's much more difficult to be a democratic hyperpower. So for example, the idea that the U.S. certainly does not want to extend or make foreign populations our subjects or even our citizens. When we talk about bringing democracy to the Middle East, no one is imagining the people of Baghdad and Fallujah voting in the next U.S. presidential elections. So that, I think, is one of the main challenges for the United States. How can we develop goodwill and cooperation and sort of better ties with the billions of people around the world who feel that they're in our shadow and dominated by us, but don't feel any loyalty? And I actually think, my book talks about this, I think there are ways that we should begin thinking about that, but they have to be 21st century ways.
And what about India? Do you see India being positioned right now to become a hyperpower?
Absolutely not. India, I think, is, things get blown out of proportion. 80% of India's population still lives on less than $2 a day. It's a developing country. That doesn't mean that it's not astonishing. What India's done also in the last 20 years. India's remarkable because it's the world's largest democracy and most diverse democracy, even more than the United States. It includes so many diverse religious and caste and sort of ethnic and just many different types of people. And they've really made it work in their own way. But the idea, I don't think India is remotely near to being a hyperpower, and I don't think that's what it wants. I think my view is that much of India, at least if you're talking about sort of the elites or the economic players, would like to be partners with the United States. I think that's more, they'd like to develop, they'd like to continue to grow. But if you just look at the numbers, it's good for perspective. I think it only represents 2% of the world's GDP. It's really not a huge player. Of course, it's got a nuclear weapon now. It's rising. It's important in the region. It's an important ally, and it's a huge source of outsourcing. So you hear a lot about that as a threat. But I just don't think. In terms of just military power, in fact, no other country comes remotely close to the United States in military and economic power. People forget that when you hear about all the troubles we're facing, but it's astounding the advantage that we have.
Of course, the Chinese have been investing a lot more of their annual budget in the military in recent years,
Absolutely.
And that has led some people to be concerned about
they're right
the possibilities there.
They're right to be concerned. I'm just talking about right now, the snapshot. What even the next 5 years will bring is another question. I don't think that a country like India can become a hyperpower, even in the next decade, although it could continue, it could become a superpower, it could, but India, like China, is just not going to be able to be at the very cutting edge of the world's technological frontier because it can't pull in the best guy from France, the best guy from Morocco, the best person from the United States. They're not intrinsically immigrant society. So they can succeed enormously, but this unusual formula that the United States has is actually fairly unique, which I think goes a long way in explaining its success. I think that's the real root of it.
And I don't know if your book suggests this, but is it not only the fact that you're bringing the immigrants together and seeking out the best and the brightest, but creating an environment in which innovation and creativity will flourish? Is that something, I know we see that happening in India to a significant extent because a lot of the emphasis of the economic development there has been in the creative, innovative areas.
Yes,
but
absolutely.
But in China, with its manufacturing base, this isn't
Less
necessarily
so.
the case.
Yeah, less so, and that is definitely part of it. In my definition of tolerance, I mean allowing all the people of all different backgrounds to rise, flourish, and I mean, really, it's a way of sort of exploiting talent. So people have to be allowed to succeed, otherwise they'll go somewhere else. China is actually on to this. I mean, China realizes that it needs to be more technologically innovative. So interestingly, they actually have programs on how to be more creative. I mean, they're trying to do this from the top down. That will be an interesting experiment to see how successful. I mean, they have, actually Western consultants in there trying to transform their education program, move it from pure memorization to more innovative thinking. And it will be interesting to see if you can do this sort of from an authoritarian perspective. Can we make people creative? And I'm a little bit dubious, but it's it's definitely something that they're conscious of, and they're also conscious of trying to bring in Western multinationals like General Electric to give technology secrets, usually not the top level, usually kind of slightly old secrets in exchange for access to the market. So China's very conscious about how they can try to be more innovative and on the cutting edge, but I really think that's someplace where they have a ways to go. That's not been their forte so far, and I think they're with energy trying to address that. So the future, what the future will bring is actually remains a big question.
And to a certain extent, China hasn't had as much of an incentive to innovate because it's grown so fast. It's been able to go out and essentially buy what it needed to. I mean, it's sort of hopped through a couple of phases of development in an instant, and if it needs it can go out and buy an entire company or a small sector of some
Right.
kind.
I think that's true, and I think that's been the focus for the last 15 years. Really, how to fuel this growth and how to. I mean, they were just focusing on getting the resources like iron ore, just to kind of continue to fuel this industrialization, which is occurring at unprecedented rates. But I do think that it is on their minds now. If you look at the different education documents that they have, I think they are also, again, China's doing a lot of things right. We have real competition. They are not being stagnant. Looking forward, I think they are actually trying to change the way that they have been so successful economically. Trying to be more innovative, trying to do more in technology. And I think that it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. But they are definitely not so much behind the curve. I mean, they know what they lack, and we know we should do the same. I mean, they're pouring money into education, so we could definitely take a lesson from that.
Let's talk for a minute about the second part of your thesis. I think most people would pretty readily understand the concept that a society that is open relative to its time and place in history would be better positioned to develop into a superpower or
Right.
a hyperpower. But the almost ironic other side of this is that in that environment ultimately lie the seeds for the destruction of the system, of not exclusively because of intolerance,
Right.
but as one part of a series of factors that contribute to a hyperpower's demise. Could you explain?
Yeah, that's the ironic part of it. The United States today, despite being so unique and so advanced, actually faces the same problem that every hyperpower in history has faced. And in a way, you could describe this as too much diversity. So what I say is, ironically, sometimes too much tolerance at a certain point sows the seeds of a hyperpower's own decline. Now, for the U.S., there are two parts to this. One is the question of the U.S. domestically. Unfortunately, from Persia to the Mongols to really every hyperpower, as they extended their power to include more and more diverse peoples, at a certain point, this diversity actually just kind of turned and became a source of division and liability. And suddenly the core group turned intolerant. Even with the Romans, it was with the German barbarians. They said, oh, this is it. With this group, they are unassimilable. These people cannot be Romans. There was a turn to intolerance, and the result was a lot of violence and division. So one question is whether internally we are are we reaching a similar point? I mean, we've had lots of nativist backlashes throughout our history. The question is, are we at a point where there's something different? You know, you hear a lot about anti-immigration sentiments, you know, having to do with our Mexican border. The war on terror has really generated a lot of concern. So one question is, are we going to become a fearful nation and kind of close down? I mean, it goes without saying that national security has to come first and that we have to be able to restrict our borders. I mean, nobody sensible wants to let everybody in, but I think it's really important that people realize that the secret to our success has always been being relatively open and confident. And I do think, I don't think it's going to happen, but I think it's possible that the sort of anxiety-filled environment would produce this kind of surge of scapegoating and backlash and closing down that could really, you know, turn the country into what I don't think it, you know, really ever was. So something that's not America.
Has your research pointed to any potential emerging hyperpowers in the future, or you didn't look that far, at least in this research effort? I
believe that at least in the modern day for now, the only way you can be a hyperpower really is essentially through immigration. That doesn't mean letting everybody in, but being able to be the place where the most talented person from Nepal or the one most brilliant guy from Chile really wants to come. And if that place becomes Canada, which right now, because it's so hard to get visas, more and more people are going there, or if it becomes Europe, or very unlikely, but if it becomes China, then we'll lose our edge. But in the near future, because there are not that many immigrant societies with our background, in a way, I feel like it's sort of ours for the losing. I mean, I think that we are uniquely well positioned if we don't make a lot of mistakes, and unfortunately, I do think that we've made mistakes.
Well, on that point, we'll conclude. I'd like to thank you, Amy Chua, for joining us today.
Thank you, John. It's a pleasure.
And thank you. For the Global Perspective Show, I'm John Bersia, and we'll see you next time.